The Black Seminole town of Pilaklakaha was the largest and most successful Black Seminole town in Florida's history. Its inception dates back to 1813. The town thrived for decades, until it was burned to the ground in retaliation for the Dade Massacre. Native American history in Florida dates back at least 14,000 years, near the end of the last ice age. Florida was nearly twice the size that it is today. Due to the massive ice sheets in the north, the water level was much lower. The theory is that early humans traveled across a land bridge connecting modern-day Siberia with Alaska. They then traveled down, migrating across the Americas, including Florida. As the planet warmed, the ice melted and Florida shrunk in size. The Native Americans flourished in Florida. When they arrived, Florida was filled with animals from the late Pleistocene period. They hunted and lived off animals like mastodons, mammoths, horses, camels, and giant land tortoises. Native Americans found their own way of life in Florida and lived and died for generation after generation. The first European explorer arrived to Florida in 1513. Ponce de Leon reached the east coast of Florida and made first contact with Florida's Native Americans, with its estimated population between 100,000 and 350,000 people. He met many tribes. Some were friendly, others were not. On one occasion, a group of natives tried to take his arms and boat that the Spanish used to reach shore. A fight ensued, and 2 Spanish soldiers were injured. 1 Native American was captured. Hernando de Soto's expedition in 1539 reached far inland. De Soto took many of Florida's natives as slaves and captured any chiefs that stood in his way. He established his power across Florida with whatever means necessary. If any tribe did not do what he asked for, he would massacre the people, burn their villages, and sick his dogs on the people. The Spanish also brought diseases, such as smallpox and measles. Florida's Native American population was nearly wiped out by disease, warfare, and the slave trade by the 1700s. A number of different Native American tribes were forced south by warfare in the 1700s and 1800s from Alabama and Georgia, mainly the Creeks, Uchis, and Yamasees. They fled into Spanish Florida and combined with the surviving Native Americans that were already there. By the late 1700s, this new group made up from different tribes would become known as Seminoles, meaning wild people or runaways. Another group of people would become welcomed into the Seminole tribes, runaway slaves from America into Spanish Florida. After the Revolutionary War, many slaves took the opportunity to escape into Florida. The percentage of African Americans in Florida was 27% in 1786. In 1814, that number jumped to 57%. Florida was very tempting for American slaves, since even the slaves owned by the Spanish had their own rights. They were allowed to marry, own property, and could buy their own freedom. And free blacks did not suffer discrimination as long as they were Catholic. Many runaway slaves from America also found their way into the hands of the Seminoles. They were not officially members of the tribe, but Black Seminoles had a strong bond with the Seminoles. They protected them from the slave catchers who entered Florida. In return, Black Seminoles offered military assistance to the Seminoles and gave them an annual tribute, a portion of their food, crops, and livestock. They typically lived nearby in separate villages, but they did marry Seminole men or women. They shared the same customs and way of life. American troops and civilians would start to raid Spanish Florida in the 1800s. They wanted more land, and Florida was poorly protected by the Spanish. There were only 3 main towns in Spanish Florida: St. Mark's, St. Augustine, and Pensacola, with a few small wooden forts littered in between. In the Patriot War of 1812, the Seminoles sided with the Spanish to fight off Americans, mainly Georgia civilians, who were supported by the militia and units from the Army, Navy, and Marines. The Patriot War was an unauthorized rebellion in an attempt to seize Spanish East Florida. It failed after the Patriots lost support from the military. The conflict lasted 2 years. A fort the Americans called Negro Fort was originally built by the British in the War of 1812 near the Pilaklakaha River. The fort was eventually left for the Indians, but a group of runaway slaves would use the fort. This enraged Americans, and in 1816, Colonel Clinch was sent to build a new fort just over the Florida border. In July of 1816, 100 soldiers and 150 Lower Creek warriors joined a supply fleet and headed up the Pilaklakaha River. Once they reached the fort, 2 U.S. gunboats positioned themselves across from the fort. The fort then fired on the 2 gunboats. The U.S. soldiers fired back at the fort. On their 9th cannon shot, they fired a hot shot. This was a heated cannonball that was glowing red. It fired at the fort. The shot landed on the fort's magazine, igniting the gunpowder and completely destroying the fort. The explosion was so massive it was heard as far away as Pensacola. 320 people were inside the fort, including women and children. Around 250 were killed instantly, and many more died from their wounds. The First Seminole War was led by General Andrew Jackson. Jackson led his army of 800 along with 1,000 Tennessee volunteers, 1,000 Georgia militia, and over 1,400 Lower Creek warriors into Florida. The war lasted until May of 1818. The U.S. had been trying to purchase Florida from the Spanish, and Jackson's invasion into Spanish territory without their permission made this a political nightmare. The negotiations were suspended, but Spain did not have a large force in Florida that could retaliate. Eventually, Spain ceded Florida to the United States in 1819 with the Adams-Orange Treaty, and the U.S. took over control in 1821. With America now controlling Florida, the Seminoles were forced onto a reservation in Central Florida with the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. The black Seminole town of Pilaklakaha lied inside the reservation and had stood here for 10 years by this point. Black Seminole warrior Abraham founded the town. It was also known as Abraham's Town by the whites. The town consisted of around 100 black Seminoles and former slaves that had escaped, mainly from Georgia. Chief Micanopy is said to have lived here also. The buildings were made from daub, thatch, and wood. Abraham was once enslaved in Pensacola, and he joined the British military to get his freedom. He helped build the fort at Prospect Bluff, which the Americans called Negro Fort. He survived the explosion and later fought Andrew Jackson's army in the First Seminole War. Pilaklakaha was first visited by the military in 1823 when the army went to invite the Seminoles to the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. It was there when they realized how fertile the region was. The Seminoles were growing rice, peanuts, and corn. In 1826, General George A. McCall visited the town. He reportedly admired their farms. They had cattle and horses. They were growing rice, beans, melons, pumpkins, and peanuts. McCall said it was the finest land. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law on May 28, 1830, by U.S. President Andrew Jackson. The law called for any Native Americans living in any state or territories to be removed and placed west of the Mississippi River. Tribes in the South would be sent to Oklahoma. Fort King was built on the edge of the reservation, and an Indian agency was set up nearby. Slave catchers would come onto the reservation and take away black Seminoles, even ones who had never been a slave before and who were born in the tribe. This caused tensions between the whites and the Seminoles. In 1832, the Seminoles were called for a meeting at Payne's Landing on the Ocklawaha River. It was here when the government tried to get the chiefs to sign the Treaty of Payne's Landing. The treaty would force the Seminoles west to current-day Oklahoma. The chiefs would be taken to see their new lands, and if they agreed, they would sign the treaty. The treaty was signed in 1833, but many chiefs later said that they did not sign or were forced to sign. Some of the Seminoles agreed to go west, but others stayed. In 1834, the Treaty of Payne's Landing was ratified by the Senate. The Seminoles were given 3 years to move west from the time of the first meeting. That meant they only had 1 year to move west. They were expected to move by 1835. The military sent reinforcements and tensions grew. Abraham had learned that a group of soldiers were on their way and thought that Pilaklakaha was about to be attacked and destroyed. Major Francis Dade and his 110 men were sent from Fort Brooke in modern-day Tampa to reinforce Fort King in modern-day Ocala. Abraham convinced Chief Micanopy that an attack was coming, and Seminole warriors were sent to the Fort King Road to wait and ambush Major Dade's column. The Seminoles waited and attacked the column. A battle raged for 5 hours. Only 3 out of the 110 men survived the attack. In retaliation, General Abraham Eustis and his men were sent to the surrounding area by General Winfield Scott to search and destroy the Seminoles. On March 30th, 1836, General Eustis and his soldiers set fire to the town of Pilaklakaha. All of its residents had fled to the Wahoo Swamp a few weeks before. The town was empty, so no one was killed, but General Eustis had sent a message to the Seminoles. The burning of Pilaklakaha was portrayed in a painting that General Eustis commissioned. It was later put on display at the Library of Congress. The area was settled in the late 1830s, and the town of Center Hill was built. Pilaklakaha was rediscovered in 1998 in a field 2 miles from the town. It's believed that Pilaklakaha was the largest black Seminole town in all of Florida. I want to thank you all for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.